Welcome everyone to our second of three webinars with the Science Votes the Future program. I'm Caitlin Bergstrom. I'm a program manager at AGU. Today, we are very lucky to be joined by Melissa Varga and Matt Hyde from Science Rising at the Union of Concerned Scientists to talk to us about countering disinformation in elections. So I will turn it over to the two of them to get started.
Great. Thanks so much, Caitlin. We are excited to be here, and we can share a little bit more about ourselves and Science Rising to kick things off. Matt, do you want to say hello first?
Yeah, hello everybody. I'm Matt Hyde. Great to be here with you today. Thanks for taking the time to spend an hour with us this afternoon. Really looking forward to it.
And I'm Melissa. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the senior manager of the Science Network at UCS and the lead organizer for Science Rising. So Science Rising is a nationwide nonpartisan movement fighting for science, justice, and equity in our democracy. We're made up of a network of organizations like AGU and UCS who are committed to empowering a new generation of leaders to help others engage in our democracy, to get out the vote and take action on the issues that they care about. So the Union of Concerned Scientists, where Matt and I work, is the lead organizing partner for Science Rising. And that's where we've gotten the bulk of our material on countering disinformation that we'll share with you today. UCS, if you're not familiar, is a science advocacy nonprofit that brings rigorous independent science to policymaking on issues like climate change, reducing the threat of nuclear weapons, and defending against attacks on science and scientists. And Science Rising set an ambitious goal for 2024 to set a new record for STEM student voter turnout this election. So a lot of our efforts have been focused on reaching faculty, students, campus leaders who can share that information to inform and empower students to get involved. But we also know that there are many barriers that make it harder for voters to actually get involved. And disinformation is increasingly one of those barriers, unfortunately. So that's why we've added this training specifically on countering disinformation around voting and elections. So our learning objectives for today, we hope that you'll walk away with a few evidence-based ways you can increase voter turnout. We'll talk through those at the beginning just to ground us in this moment that we're in, so close to the election, and then spend the bulk of the time talking about techniques, best practices, and pitfalls to avoid when countering disinformation. But I'm going to hand it over now to Caitlin to talk more about Science Votes the Future.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. For any of you who haven't joined us for any of these webinars before, I'll share a little bit more about AGU's Get Out the Vote effort, Science Votes the Future. Next slide. So our primary goal for Science Votes the Future this year is to get as many scientists voting in the election as possible. So far this year, we have had almost 600 scientists sign our voting pledge. We also have a tool on our website that allows you to search for your polling place and check your registration, along with some other information like being able to search your candidates. So we've had over 100 scientists check their polling place, more than 50 check their registration, and we also have had more than 2,000 of you check out our website for all the great information that we have. In addition to Get Out the Vote efforts, we also are hosting this series of webinars on giving scientists more information about how they can be involved in elections. So, of course, today you'll be learning about countering disinformation. A few weeks ago, we had a webinar on understanding your First Amendment rights as a scientist with the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund. There is a recording of that on our website, so you can find that recording if you're interested in getting involved in elections, but maybe you receive federal grants or a federal employee or a private employee and you just want to be able to better understand how you can get involved in elections. We do only have 26 days to the election, which feels both long and short. But for a lot of states, or a lot of places, of course, registering to vote is the first step in voting. So there are a few states where voter registration deadlines have already passed. So Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Indiana, Kentucky, Mississippi, Ohio, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Missouri. Those voter registration deadlines have passed. But there are 2 coming up this week. So if you are in Oklahoma or Delaware, please use our tool to make sure that your voter registration is up to date. And if you've just moved to those places, that you are registered to vote. Next slide. So you can find our tool to check your voter registration status, as well as the recording of our previous webinar on sciencevotesthefuture.org. So you can make sure that you are up and ready to vote. We have a few more resources on engaging with your candidates and actually signing our pledge to vote if you are interested. That's all I have. I'll turn it back to Melissa and Matt.
Thanks, Caitlin. And I feel like you did a great job of laying out why we're here. So we can move on to some of the good news that we've seen around voter turnout recently. In 2020, voter turnout hit record levels. 66.8% of the voting age population voted in 2020. That was an increase of 5.4% over 2016. And importantly, student voter turnout also increased dramatically in 2020. The overall national student voting rate increased by 14% over 2016 levels, reaching 66% in 2020. And we actually have student voter turnout breakdowns by fields of study, thanks to the National Study of Learning, Voting, and Engagement at Tufts University. Some of you may have heard that STEM students have the lowest voter turnout rates of any field of study, but I am pleased to share that we saw double-digit increases in voter turnout across all STEM fields in 2020. So there's a lot to be excited about around positive trends around voting. So let's talk about ways we can keep those positive trends going in the last few weeks before the 2024 election. The good news is these best practices for increasing voter turnout are very similar to other best practices for science communication and science advocacy that you may have heard before. It's all about tapping into your networks that you have already been building and strengthening to continue to build those relationships. Connect with people through shared values, and above all else, listen to where people are coming from and approach these conversations in good faith. So here are 4 tactics, evidence-based tactics for increasing voter turnout. First, talk about voting as a social norm, something everyone is doing. In 2 Get Out the Vote field experiments, researchers found that messages emphasizing low expected turnout are less effective at motivating voters than messages emphasizing high expected turnout. So these findings suggest that talking about voting as the expected norm may help increase turnout, especially among voters who aren't regular voters or only vote infrequently. So if you're organizing a voter mobilization effort or just talking with folks in your community about voting, emphasize high anticipated turnout, especially if you're talking to folks who don't vote regularly. Additionally, this study suggests that the way the media covers low participation in our elections may further undermine turnout. So there's a reason that I started this presentation off talking by the increase in voting we saw in 2020 rather than the typical low turnout of STEM students, because I don't want to further perpetuate this trend. Second, make a plan to vote and make it specific. In one study of more than 287,000 registered voters, researchers saw an increased turnout of 4.1% and up to 9.1% for single voter households, simply by asking voters what time they would vote, where they would be coming from on their way to the polls, and what they would be doing beforehand. 4.1% might not seem like a lot, but in close elections where a few hundred votes can decide the winner, a 4% difference can make a huge impact. So if you're talking with someone in your network and want to increase the likelihood that they actually cast their ballot, walk through some of these questions with them. This study was conducted pre-pandemic, so there was more of a focus on in-person voting, but the same tactics would apply if you're voting by mail. When will you sit down to fill out your ballot? How and when are you going to mail it? Do you need stamps? Do you have stamps? Things like that. Third, recruit 3 friends to vote. This is also called vote tripling, and it really is as simple as asking 3 friends to vote and following up with them to make sure that they actually make that plan to vote like we just talked about. One study of voter engagement found that when a person was asked to vote by someone that they knew, the likelihood of them voting increased by 8.3%. Again, the 8.3% can make a big difference, especially in close elections. And this works because in comparison to interactions with strangers who may be canvassing at your door, familiar relationships provide better opportunities for contact. You are that trusted messenger with your friends, your family, your community members. So the people in your network are more likely to listen to you. Another great thing about this study is that it looked at people doing vote tripling through text message. So we know that it works on different platforms, and we know it doesn't just have to be an in-person conversation. You can try this through text or social media or other platforms. And finally, find the right messenger. Vote tripling can be really powerful for getting your friends and family to vote if you are in line with them. But what if you're trying to reach people who are outside of your direct network? Or what if you're not the best messenger to reach your friends and family? There's some interesting social mobilization research that finds that politically disengaged people or non-activists may be the most powerful messengers of all, because they signal that this time, it is really important to get involved. It's not just the usual suspects who are engaging. So if you are that activist, or if your friends or family see you as that activist, you could try looking for someone who is a little bit less engaged and helping them reach out to their network as a more powerful way of reaching more folks. So your homework for today is I hope you will take 3 minutes to either make a plan to vote and or recruit 3 friends to vote. This really only takes a couple minutes, but we know that both of these things can really make a difference. I recommend TurboVote as a tool, but you could also, it sounds like, use Science Votes the Future for a lot of these to find this valuable information about your polling place, your voter registration status, all that good stuff, so that you can actually make a plan to vote. And then again, to recruit 3 friends, just reach out, ask them to commit to voting this election. If they need any information, you can direct them to either of these resources, TurboVote or Science Votes the Future, and then set a reminder for yourself to follow up with them as we get a little bit closer to the election. So that's the positive stuff, but we know that there's disinformation that we need to look out for. So I'm going to hand it over to Matt so he can warn us what not to do.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. And as you highlighted so well, Melissa, there's a lot to be excited about in terms of student voting and civic participation. However, we also know that anti-democratic forces are also paying attention to these trends, and they're pushing back, from creating barriers to voter registration, limiting access to polling places, restricting early voting and vote by mail, and passing more restrictive voter ID laws. Efforts to suppress the vote are underway and very active in advance of the election. And we know that those same anti-democratic actors, those bad actors whose actions are bad for our democracy, are and will continue to deploy disinformation as a key tactic as part of their efforts to suppress the vote. And because the reality is that getting out the vote also means overcoming those who are trying to stop us, it's important to also understand how you can counter disinformation effectively. To start, I did just want to make sure that we're clear on some basic terminology, especially the distinction between disinformation and misinformation, which you often see thrown around and used sometimes interchangeably, but they do have very distinct and different meanings. Disinformation is false information that is deliberately, intentionally, on purpose, spread by bad actors, usually for their political or financial gain. Misinformation, on the other hand, is false information that is unintentionally spread by anyone. So this is information that somebody may believe is true, as unaware that it's false, and are sharing it. So that's misinformation. Another way to shorthand this, you can think about misinformation as being an honest mistake, whereas disinformation is neither honest nor a mistake. So when you think about disinformation and how it's used to enable voter suppression efforts, we know that in the United States, there's a long history of bad actors using deceptive practices to spread false information in an attempt to trick people out of voting, particularly to keep Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color or marginalized communities away from the polls. And unfortunately, we are almost certain to see these deceptive practices and disinformation increase probably dramatically over the next 26 days leading up to the election. When we think about the types of disinformation that we're likely to see, there's two primary categories of disinformation that bad actors will seek to use to reduce and suppress the vote. The first is intimidation, to scare people away from voting. The second is confusion, to make it hard to understand or get people confused about different aspects of the voting process, with the net result that they end up not voting. Types of disinformation we'll see in the first category of intimidation includes false reports of law enforcement presence, immigration enforcement actions, election monitoring by armed individuals. You can think of other examples, legal repercussions of people who voted in the wrong location by accident. These sorts of falsehoods and lies are designed to like scare people from voting. Confusion, usually it can consist of a range of false reports and statements about when and how people can vote, where you can vote, what methods, what day, what time, what location, false statements about candidates' positions or actions, false reports or statements about the electoral and vote counting process. All of these types of false claims are designed to confuse or make people less likely to know the actual facts and information they need to ensure that their voice and their vote is heard and counted. So that's what we're up against. That's what we're looking at over the next, 3+ weeks. But the good news is there are things you can do to help mitigate the harm and damage and blunt the efforts of these. There's three sort of key steps that I wanted to outline in our training today. Step one is focused on inoculation, which is the idea that you can warn and inoculate others in advance of a specific claim or point of disinformation circulating. So this is a proactive tactic where you're actively countering disinformation before it hits the ground and really starts to gain traction. So there's a couple of different dimensions of inoculation. One of the basics is just to alert people about likely incoming types of disinformation. So this is like, heads up, have your radar up. You're going to see disinformation incoming or increasing about X, Y, and Z topics. So just alerting people and making them aware that disinformation will be circulating on particular topics makes them more likely, primes their minds and awareness to be more careful in scrutinizing claims that they might see online. So you're sort of activating their disinformation immune system, if you will. As part of that, if you're able to name bad actors or their motivations for the types of disinformation we're seeing, you will likely see, false claims about when and where you can vote, because certain bad actors are seeking to silence your vote in order to maintain their power and wealth, for example. And similarly, as part of that, regularly amplifying correct information and trustworthy sources whenever possible. So this is the sort of the proactive, constant drumbeat effort to ensure that instead of trying to counter bad actors flooding the zone with false and bad information, we're flooding the zone with correct, accurate, and factual information instead, especially factual information that we know will counter the types of disinformation claims that will be made. Some examples of inoculation. We already saw this one, right? This was the one that we created last year, which is highlighting the sort of 4 ways that democratic forces will use to suppress the student vote. So same sort of thing, like heads up, these are the types of strategies that will be deployed against you in your efforts to vote. Be watchful, be ready, be aware. Some other common constructions you could use for the, a social media post or an article or blog post or something, some other form of communication. I love the like disinformation alert, and then put in like what to be watchful for. Be watchful for false claims about when, where, and how you can vote. Don't be fooled by false claims designed to intimidate you from voting. Get the facts, right? So you're warning people what's coming on what topics and pointing them to the correct and accurate information. I pulled a couple of good examples I found around some sort of inoculation examples around messaging, which highlight some of these basic trends as well. This is proactive messaging. We all deserve to have our voices heard, value statements of what we're supporting. However, disinformation spreaders are trying to breed confusion to silence us so they gain power, naming the bad actors and their motivations. Check your registration and get the info you need from your state election sites. Point people to the correct and accurate sources of information they need. We know we're going to see all kinds of bogus claims around election results and vote counting, right? So putting messages out like this in advance of the election, when it comes to election results, accuracy is more important than speed. Election officials must take the time to do their job and ensure every vote is accurately and securely counted before we declare a winner, right? So we're sort of countering the disinformation about election counting and results before it hits there. So the correct information is out there in the information environment proactively rather than in response and reactive response to the disinformation that we'd see. So step 1, inoculate others in advance. Step 2, and I always say, if there's one thing you take away from this entire hour, it's this one, which is do not amplify, share, or promote disinformation. Don't engage with, waste time debunking, or share garbage with others. Do not further spread the disinformation and help the bad actors you're trying to fight, right? So bad actors are trying to manipulate people to spread their lies and falsehoods for them, right? So they exploit our tendency to want to call out, debunk, fact check their claims by spreading their claims further, right? And so this is like, you see this time and time again, bad actors are trying to get us to do their bad work for them by baiting us to respond to react to further spread and talk about their lies and falsehoods, rather than regularly amplifying correct information, trustworthy sources, and advancing our messages and narratives. So in particular, I'm sure all of you have seen examples like this one, which is like, oh, to counter disinformation, I need to fact check and myth bust this false claim. And to do that, I will prominently highlight the myth that I'm seeking to counter and undermine and debunk. And then underneath it, and then I'll explain why this is false as well. So this is an example I pulled from the 2020 California Secretary of State website of all places. And what have they done? They have prominently highlighted in this gold box the myth, the false lie that they're trying to debunk. But what? And then they put the actual information in this much smaller font on white and below that. And when people see this, what's the first thing they're going to look at? What's the thing that they're more likely to remember or lodge in their brain after seeing this? It's the myth that they prominently highlighted. Like, I'm sure you've seen other examples of like 10 myths about X debunked, and they just outline and put in boldface the myths and then debunk them. Please, please don't do this. This is like, the bad actors love this stuff. They're like, all right, somebody just like gave us sent around the top 10 lists of our best falsehoods and are amplifying it for us. Great. Instead, think about leading with and highlighting the facts first. This is an example from the Brennan Center, which does a lot of work on voting and election integrity, right? So they are instead putting prominently and visibly the fact, the correct and accurate information first, and then underneath it, talking a little bit more about it, as well as obliquely referencing the falsehood and lie that the fact is countering. So fact first, not falsehood first. An easy way to think about this is, when you say don't amplify, share, or promote disinformation, you want to replace, not repeat the disinformation. So replace it with the correct factual information. Don't repeat it. All right. So one of the questions often is, well, how on earth can you counter disinformation when you're saying, well, I can't even say what it is that I'm seeking to counter? And there's different ways you can do this to reference it obliquely, along like, lots of false claims are circulating online about where and when you can vote. Here's the information. You can reference that this information is circulating. You can even reference potentially by whom, but without needing to like spell out and repeat the disinformation itself. That being said, there are times when you do need to counter a specific false claim. That's because it's either gained such widespread traction that it's all over the media. You hear your friends and family talking about it, your conversations going on. It's sort of entered the mainstream consciousness and people are talking and discussing it. So there are cases where you do need to confront a piece of disinformation head on. So if a piece of disinformation is gaining widespread traction, your best technique in response is what we call a truth sandwich, which looks something like this, where you have facts on the top and bottom, and you squish and bury and surround the lie in the middle with the facts on either side. You want to lead with fact and correct information, reference the lie that you're debunking, and then close again by reinforcing the fact and correct information that you want to see propagated. So this was an example I shared earlier from the Brennan Center. So this is like a textbook example of a short, succinct truth sandwich, right? So they started off, fact, voting by mail and using drop boxes are safe and trustworthy. They then obliquely reference, we've seen numerous social media posts falsely claiming that drop boxes, voting by mail, or absentee voting ballot are vehicles for mass voter fraud. So they're naming the lie in the middle and then closing it. But the reality is that mail ballots have been successfully used, et cetera, fact, lie, fact. The other thing, there's two things I want to flag about the lie portion, which they do a good job here, which is when you do reference the lie, explicitly say that it's false. That's a lie. We've seen numerous social media posts falsely claiming so that people are primed. So everything that comes after that falsely, people will know is incorrect. Versus like we've seen numerous social media posts claiming that Dropbox is voting by mail, right? It's like, there's a subtle difference, but clearly and explicitly naming that it's untrue is crucial. They don't do this here, but if you're able to reference or identify the bad actors and the motivations behind spreading the lie, also helps to debunk the credibility of that claim in people's minds. All right, so step one, inoculate. Step two, replace, don't repeat. Step three, deploy a truth sandwich if you must. So we're going to put all of these together into a fun group activity, which is called How to Respond. So the way this works, I'm going to present 3 examples of different types of disinformation related to the election. And then I'll present all of you with 3 choices for how you could respond. And more than one of these choices could be correct or doable. To help you think through the type of responses you might do, we've developed this response framework, which helps you evaluate a piece of disinformation based on how widely it's spread and how impactful it is. So, for example, in the upper left, we have a high impact and high spread. So damaging and harmful information that is being widely spread and shared. versus like a high impact and low spread, damaging, harmful information, but is not getting a lot of circulation, not a lot of pickup. And then the lower impact, so it's low impact, it's something that's like kind of ridiculous or false, but if people believe it in some way, it's not going to cause harm or damage to people, communities, people's rights, people's ability to speak or vote or have their opinions heard. So even if it's high spread, it has lower impact. And then there's like low impact and low spread. So it's a low impact scenario, it's not getting a lot of traction. So under each of those, you see the sort of the recommended approaches: high impact, high spread, inoculate people against it, expose who's behind it, and report it to either the platforms you're seeing it on, or depending where you are in the situation, the authorities. High impact and low spread, inoculate people and report it. And the low impact ones are mostly in the ignore or strategic silence, potentially inoculate if it's high spread. All right. Are we ready? And okay. Scenario 1. You see a social media post with 12 likes, no shares from an unverified account with 707 followers that shares the wrong date and location for an upcoming election. In this scenario, do you alert your community by sharing and debunking it so they know it and the sender are bogus? Do you 2, send out a new post with the correct information? Or 3, you report it to the platform? And you can go ahead and just drop in the chat here, whether it's you think 1, 2, or 3. And again, it can be more than one, would be the correct approaches here. It'll take a minute for you to process and drop your answer in the chat. All right, seeing lots of 2s and 3s. Great. Glad to see everybody engaged and following along. So let's take a look at this in the context of our framework here. So in this particular example, this was high impact, right? It was sharing information that if people believed it, they would be unable to vote because they'd show up at the wrong day and the wrong location, and they'd have their power as a voter denied to them. But it was low spread. We saw, it's like not a ton of followers, only a limited number of likes, not what hadn't been shared at all. So in this case, definitely, we don't want to amplify it. We don't want to share the post or debunk it. We want to clarify or inoculate. So sending out a message and sharing the correct and accurate information and sources about where and when to vote to help cover the information environment. Correct information, definitely, and then report it to the platforms as false information is the way to go. So good job, everybody. All right, scenario 2. Students at a state university received text messages, and this is all the students at a state university, that because of high anticipated voter turnout, polling locations on campus will also be open on Wednesday, the day after Election Day, and students are urged to wait a day to cast their ballot. All right, in this scenario, do you post a screenshot of the text message on social media to warn and alert others about the disinformation? You 2, report it to the authorities? Or 3, do you amplify the correct and factual information and point to recommended and trusted sources of information? Does everybody think 1, 2, or 3? All right, you guys are quick on the answering. Well done. So let's take a look at our framework again. So this is an example of high impact, right? If people show up on Wednesday, the day after the election day, they'd be like, why are you here? The polls are closed. The election's over. They would have missed their chance to vote. Very impactful. And we saw that it was a text message that went out to all students. So very high spread scenario. So yes, in this case, you want to inoculate people, so you can warn people, like heads up, many of you may have received a text message giving false information about when you are able to vote. The facts are you Tuesday, name the locations where you can vote, and then report it. This is, clearly reportable either to, at a minimum, to campus authorities, potentially to the police, like who knows what how the bad actors obtained and executed text messages to all students. And if it becomes to light who's behind this effort, name them and hold them to account as well. I did want to flag, just to go back for a second, this first one is one of the worst things you could do, right? We talked about don't amplify or repeat, but this one would be particularly bad to do because you'd be taking the disinformation from one communication platform, text messaging, putting a screenshot, and then migrating it over to social media to further expand its reach and damage. And so that if folks did number one, that would be like a grand slam home run for the bad actors behind this. They're like, woohoo, we got it spread. And now students are now sharing it all over social media for us. Thank you, students. All right, last one. Scenario 3. A well-known celebrity posts a widely viewed Instagram reel falsely claiming that quote unquote woke universities are secretly tracking individual student voting behavior and keeping a record of those who vote the quote unquote wrong way. Students should protect their privacy by not voting. Do you share the Instagram reel and mock the celebrity for their ignorance with hilarious snark? Do you add a comment on social media to the post in question, correcting the false information and pointing to credible sources? Or do you, 3, in a separate post, name some of the bad actors behind such statements and point to more credible sources of information? All right, lots of 2s and 3s again. So let's take a look. So again, this is another example of high impact, right? Like it's people bought into this and didn't vote to quote unquote protect their privacy. Then the vote would be suppressed. The students would lose their ability to have their voices heard. And it's high spread, right? It was a widely viewed reel from a well-known celebrity. So in this case, definitely don't share the post. Definitely do highlight and share credible sources of information that correct the false information. And then this is sort of a squishier, potentially by doing number 2, by commenting on the post directly and or deploying a truth sandwich. So this is a tricky one, right? In whether or not to comment on the post in question. And there's a couple of sort of guiding questions that it might be helpful for this. One is like it's not clear from the particular scenario that I shared whether or not this well-known celebrity is knowingly spreading false information or has been duped themselves by bad actors and they think the information is correct and they're spreading it. So they'd be, from their perspective, this would be misinformation as well. So it's a little unclear. So the value of like putting a comment on there saying, hey, well-known celebrity, just wanted to let you know that what you shared is being spread by bad actors seeking to suppress the vote and is actually incorrect. Here are the correct sources of information. We've seen examples where the celebrity's like, oh, I had no idea. Let me correct this, or responds accordingly. There's a trade-off though, because the more people comment on a post, the more the platform sees it as generating engagement, the more it elevates that post in question. So another check is like if people have already commented on the post with such thing, pointing to correct sources of information, then depending on the platform, you can potentially like or upvote that comment or comment on that comment to reinforce that piece. Or if it's already been covered, there's no need to add additional engagement from your end to that to let it go. So there's that. Or you can deploy in a separate post the true sandwich approach, like heads up, well-known celebrity is circulating false claims about student voting. Here's the correct information type approach. So that was our exercise. We're doing great on time. That's the end of my section. I'm going to now pass it back to Melissa.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So we have been focused pretty heavily on, the next few weeks leading up to the election, but Democratic engagement doesn't stop after November 5th. We need you all to stay engaged. So a couple of things that you can sort of start planning for or looking out for after the election. Of course, once we know the outcomes, right? So you can take the time to learn about your newly elected officials. Once they have their offices set up, learn more about them and their priorities, and you can start building relationships with them and their staff. You can also lean on organizations like AGU and UCS to help you connect with those decision makers through lobby days, in-district meetings, other action opportunities where our organizations can provide you with some of the background information and talking points on specific issues or policies that they may be voting on. In 2025, it's also time to start identifying what we call policy windows based on what's possible to advance under the new political landscape. So a policy window is a limited opening for introducing or passing legislation or otherwise advancing a particular issue. And these often emerge when there's a change in administration or a change of Congress or sort of like a change in national mood. Any of which may happen post-election. We will have to see. So UCS has a webinar coming up on November 21st about the policy opportunities that we're keeping an eye on as we head into 2025. I really hope we'll have a sense of who the new administration is and what Congress looks like at that point. I'll put a link to that webinar in the chat. And I know Caitlin's going to talk to you about another one as well. But finally, I did also want to mention this really applies across all of these steps to join forces with other scientists and scientist advocates and community members to get involved in all of these different ways. Policy change is hard. It takes a lot of people to make an impact, and we really need to take collective action to make a difference on the issues that we're working on, whether that's, restoring our democratic institutions or reducing the impacts of climate change or whatever the next crisis is. So I hope that you'll consider taking action with us by joining the UCS Science Network as one way you can stay involved. We offer ways for scientists to sort of transform their concerns into action, to defend against attacks on science and scientists, and to embrace their roles as scientist advocates in their own communities. So, for example, we train and coach our Science Network members to meet with their state legislators and members of Congress to pass science-based policies. We also call on our Science Network members to write public comments to help strengthen public protections and regulations, testify in front of decision makers, provide technical support to community groups, many different ways you can get involved, and ways you can use your expertise as well. So you can get started by signing up at the link on the screen and in the chat, maybe? Yes, okay. Excellent. And Caitlin, do you want to talk about your upcoming webinar as well now, and then we can take some time for Q&A?
Yeah. You want to go one more slide, Matt? I don't know if it ended up working on the slide. Okay, no worries. So our next webinar is going to be November 19th. It's going to be on scientific advocacy with Congress and administrative agencies. So we are hoping that we know the results of the election by then, so we can be prepared either way for ways that we can engage with a new administration and a new Congress, regardless of what the political shakeout of that will be. This is going to be with Climate Science Legal Defense Fund again, and they are a really excellent resource for helping scientists engage and engage safely. I think that's all I have. I would love if people can either drop questions in the chat or come off mute because we're not too huge of a group. But either way.
Right. And while folks are thinking, I do see a question from Jonathan about sort of how different social media platforms interpret or different forms of engagement on posts as well. And so there's a couple of things I'll say. It's like every platform is different. Every platform's algorithm is a black box to a certain extent. So there's only so much we know or can say about this. I will say that, one of the unfortunate differences between 2020 and 2024 is in the intervening 4 years, a lot of platforms, including Meta, including X, have like really gutted their content moderation staff. So while there's no harm in reporting content, they have far fewer people and staff dedicated to it before. So depending on the platform, if there's an option to append a community note, as you mentioned in the comment here, or some other ways to flag on the post itself that this is suspect or a claim that it's worth doing. But it's hard for me to, the concept of like the ratio between likes and comments on a particular post and how algorithms interpret that is probably true, but it's like, it's only so much we know and can say for sure.
I do have a question.
Go for it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Amanda is my name. So this was very helpful. I'm actually very impressed at how helpful it was. And I kind of want to share the information with other people who aren't scientists, other friends of mine, people, if I want to triple my vote. And I really would like to, is there a video or maybe like a small little, not a PowerPoint, but like a little YouTube video that kind of shows the key points that you made here that I could share with some of my friends, because we're all very active on social media and we want to make sure that we're doing the right things, because this was very eye-opening.
Yeah, so this webinar is being recorded, so you are welcome to share this with other people if that's helpful. But Melissa and Matt, do you guys have anything shorter that you have available? I know you have tons of great resources.
Yeah, we definitely have some shorter videos, especially on the countering disinformation pieces that we can link to in the chat to make sure you get those. There we go. Matt just shared them. That's our roundup of information on countering disinformation on the UCS website, which has, I think, a full toolkit that walks through in more depth some of the pieces that Matt was talking about, as well as a few quick videos that are meant to be shared on social media. This information was pulled from much longer train the trainer trainings that we offered through Science Rising. So if you want the full sort of like roundup of information, you can find it on the Science Rising link that Matt shared, which includes a template presentation and all of the original sources of information in case you want to go back and do some more digging there. Matt, anything else you want to add?
No, just mostly first, thank you, Amanda, for both finding this useful and be willing to share this with so many others, because sort of the basic literacy and the sort of these are debunking of common misassumptions about the best ways to respond to disinformation is like so foundational to the work. I included a link to the Science Rising link there. There's a series of 6 sort of 2 to 4 minute videos that we collaborated with on a consultant who specializes in countering disinformation that are great. And collectively, they're about 25 minutes. You can watch them bit by bit. It's how we frame up our longer training on this work. And so on both those pages, and those videos would be great, succinct ways to share with your friends and allies in this effort.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions or thoughts or musings otherwise?
I don't know, people ruminate on other questions. I think the point about the, don't debunk, like, is something like, it's a common misassumption that a lot of people make, but we found that it's particularly common within the scientific community, right? Which is what, if somebody sees something false and their immediate reaction is, but the facts, right? It's sort of this sort of gut reaction. It's something that many of us are trained and taught in school and university to like center and lead with the facts to counter false information. And so we found that particular misassumption particularly prevalent amongst the scientific community. So the more, like I said, if you take one thing from this training, it's that one thing. If you share and work with others to change their approach to countering disinformation, highlighting that piece would be something I would really encourage you to do.
Yeah, that was definitely news to me, and I'm glad that I know it now. I don't know that I'm often a reply guy on the internet anyway, but I think you're totally right. That is a really common response for scientists because that's just how we're trained. But I know all these methods are also like studied and backed too. So, okay, well, it seems like we don't have any more questions, but if folks do, you can always email me or sciencepolicy@agu.org is our team email, and we can get all of your questions to Melissa and Matt or share with whoever would be the best. Yeah, thank you again. I learned a lot, and there will be a recording posted of this on our Science Votes the Future website, and I'll send it out to the full list as well, so you can share this with anyone who you think might find it useful. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.